Welcome to another episode of Tank Talks, your personal think tank for all things startups and venture capital. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. On today's show, we are talking about building productivity tools for the non-tech world with co-founder and CEO of Almanac, Adam Nathan. Adam shares a story about how he stumbled upon building Almanac after spending several years working to disrupt the status quo at places like Varo Bank, Lyft, and even the Obama administration. We dig into how Adam and his team initially came up with the idea to build Almanac, even before remote work was truly mainstream, and how his time working with engineers using GitHub shaped his vision for building Almanac. We talk about Adam's views on remote work and how he doesn't believe companies can be hybrid without being a cloud-first organization, and how he is building out his team at Almanac. Finally, we discuss his recent $34 million Series A fundraise led by the lightning-fast team at Tiger Global, and what his plans are for next year as the company officially launches out of beta. But before we get started today, as our listeners probably know by now, the team at Ripple is always focused on helping our founders and CEOs find the best partners to work with. However, before we initiate any provider with intros to our companies, we always make sure to try the product first. And when it came to managing our fund expenses at Ripple, we were super excited when the team at Jeeves came knocking on our door. The team at Jeeves helped get me and my team set up with physical and virtual cards in days. I was able to allow my teammates to expense items in multiple currencies, allowing them to pay for anything, anywhere, at any time. We weren't asked for any personal guarantees or to pay any setup or annual fees either. Not only does Jeeves save us time, but they also give us up to 3% cash back on our purchases, including expenses like Google, Facebook, or AWS every month. The best part, Jeeves puts up the cash and you settle up once every 30 days, unlike some other corporate card companies that make you prepay every month. Jeeves offers a truly all-in-one expense management corporate card program for international startups, and we at Tank Talks could not be more excited to officially partner with them. Listeners of Tank Talks can get set up with a demo of Jeeves today and take advantage of our Tank Talks special with a $700 sign-up bonus and skip the waitlist that already has thousands of companies waiting by visiting tryjeeves.com/Tank Talks to get set up today. Now let's get into this week's episode with Adam Nathan, co-founder and CEO of Almanac. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Adam.
Great, happy to be here.
So for everyone who has been involved in technology companies for the last few decades, it feels like every few years someone comes along with a new way to break apart the legacy tech stacks we are attached to, like Microsoft Office or G Suite, but ends up with limited success. However, in the last few years, it feels like we've been seeing this unbundling and repackaging of products like Gmail with Superhuman and Hangouts with Zoom and countless other platforms trying to replace these stale products that have to be turned into multi-billion-dollar tech companies. So, Adam, I would love to kick things off with how you stumbled your way into the tech world after graduating from Harvard MBA, ended up taking on the challenge of disrupting Google Docs and Microsoft Office with Almanac.
My background is in systems engineering. That's what I got my undergraduate studies and first master's degree in. And I spent a bunch of time working on complex issues before getting into tech. Right after college, I worked in the Obama White House on the National Economic Council, working on issues like passing Obamacare, which was healthcare reform and financial regulatory reform. After that, I went to work for a nonprofit consulting firm where I helped start a new practice area around poverty alleviation. And then before business school, I worked at an airline on the network planning and strategy team. And so I was always attracted to really systems issues and how individuals can make an impact on them. And I had the opportunity while at HBS to intern at Apple. I knew nothing about technology. I didn't even own an iPhone. They had to send me one. And I was on the product marketing team, which is like product management for iOS. And one of my first few days at Apple was WWDC, which is Apple's annual conference where they announce typically new operating system versions. And I remember going to the Moscone Center in downtown San Francisco and seeing just thousands of developers who lined up hours early to get into the keynote address. And I never seen anything like it, just the level of excitement and enthusiasm for building on top of Apple's platform. And that the creativity and collaboration that emerged during that conference made me realize that for me to make a difference on the types of issues I cared about, technology and more broadly, the startup ecosystem for devising and testing and scaling ideas could have a much greater impact on the challenges and opportunities of our time than working in other sectors, at least from my perspective. And so that's when I decided to get into tech. And I was, before Almanac, a product manager for about 8 years at Apple, and then at Lyft, where I ran pricing, and then right before Almanac at a fintech company called Varo, which is like a neobank. And across all those companies, which are obviously different sizes and stages, I saw really similar problems, mainly that a lot of people, myself included, were spending time doing work that didn't feel like work, constantly sitting in meetings all day long, surreptitiously looking at Slack and email notifications. There was no time to actually do the work I was hired to do, the work that I woke up in the morning to do. Instead, I spent all day just trying to get very basic forms of collaboration done. Like, did my boss read this email? Or did the team agree with this idea I sent over in a document? Or where are people on a particular task? Stuff that you'd assume we would spend a lot less time on than we do all day long. And I had this contrast with the engineers I worked with who use a tool called GitHub to collaborate on code. And GitHub, for anyone who doesn't know, is a platform that enables asynchronous collaboration on code. So, and the engineers that I worked with were both a lot more focused and productive than I was, and also seemingly happier at their jobs. And somewhere in my time at Lyft, we started transitioning on the design side from a tool called Sketch, which is an amazing design editor, to a tool called Figma. And the difference between Sketch and Figma is that Figma is more than just a design editor. It's actually a platform that exists in your browser that integrates collaboration with creation. And so, in addition to just designing, in Figma, you can leave comments, you can build prototypes, you can structure engineering handoffs. Before Figma, when we had Sketch, while our designers would do beautiful things in Sketch, you actually had to like send around these huge Sketch files. You'd had to have all these meetings to do basic things like give feedback and bring people into projects. And so the world before Figma looked a lot like, I think, the world for most business professionals now, which is that you have a ton of different tools. You have to manually manage across them. Meetings are the preferred form of collaboration. And what I saw in this transition from Sketch to Figma at Lyft was that all of a sudden, when everything was in one place, we actually could have a lot fewer meetings, and we could work more asynchronously, and therefore people could actually focus on what they had to do in a design process. And so I started thinking about, why doesn't everyone else have tools like GitHub and Figma? Why aren't there platforms like these that enable work to happen a lot more efficiently with a lot more focus for business professionals? And that's what brought me to Almanac.
That's amazing. I mean, I'd love to get into the collaboration part of like, what brought you there and how you ended up getting there. But there was something you mentioned early on, which was you worked at the White House on the regulatory reform for Dodd-Frank and Obamacare. It sounds like disrupting the OGs of industry is running your DNA for quite some time. And then you also worked at Varo Bank, which is, for some people who don't know this, the first digital first bank to ever receive a bank charter, which is pretty impressive on the product side in 2017. So what drove you to take on these roles to make you so focused on disrupting the status quo?
Yeah, it's interesting you frame it that way. For me, it's more about how I think I can contribute to making the world better, and that the challenges that we face as a society really are outpacing our abilities to solve them. And so the if you just open the newspaper really any day these days, the scale, the complexity, the speed of the challenges is totally outwitting us, and it feels like the tools that we have are not up to the task of helping us continue, in some cases, the survival of our species. Certainly solve problems nationally, problems locally, even. And it's really frustrating, I think, for me and everyone else to see like almost the future slip from our hands. And so, because I'm a systems person, I always think about, okay, this isn't. What about the system isn't working? And so my time when you look at my career from that perspective, President Obama was elected, I think, on the promise of hope and change. And my interpretation of that was really about trying to change how our politics got done. And I'm not here to debate whether or not he succeeded at that, but I think what got people so excited, me included, was this idea that we can change how we work together to solve problems. When I went to work in nonprofit consulting after that, was that it seems like our economy and our society in the United States was leaving a lot of people behind, and people had no way to change their position. And that's, if you look at that problem through the lens of everybody is doing the best that they can, there are no bad actors, and there's something broadly not working about the system in general. And so, and that's true, as you mentioned, Varo, in fintech, where if you're super wealthy in this country, you have great financial services, but there are hundreds of millions of Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck, have no money in savings, and yet actually have to spend a lot more money for basic financial services like checking and savings compared to rich Americans. Like, I pay nothing for my checking account, but most Americans on the low income side spend hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars, in fees a year. And so that things like that, where like the world feels upside down, have always really intrigued me. I kind of have structured my career around what can I do to make a difference on these types of systemic issues, so that the world feels more just and more progressive. And I think this challenge that we face around work is one of the biggest yet. We can get more into Almanac, but one of the things we could not have predicted when we started the company was that the pandemic happened, of course, which is, we think, a huge one-way door into the shift into remote and distributed work. We think every job that can be distributed will be within the next 5 or 10 years. But also you just can't put the old way of work, what we call office culture, onto the new way. And the best evidence we have of that is that people are quitting their jobs en masse. You see massive exhaustion, burnout, disaffection across the entire economy, and people just not showing up to their jobs. Regular professionals out there in every industry are making the case for our product better than we ever could through our own marketing or materials. And so I think you can see, around work in general, that something is broadly wrong, and that people are just en masse saying, like, I don't want to do it anymore. And I think that's what makes, for me, what we're building in Almanac so compelling.
Yeah, it's super interesting to hear you say like it's been a one-way door. Like once you go through, you are not coming back the other way. But I also love how you say, you question the way processes were being done, the status quo. It makes sense now. You systems engineer, so you think about systems differently, but also you have a Harvard MBA, which is basically questioning why for everything. So that makes perfect sense, those two combined, how you ended up stumbling your way through Obama administration and then onto Varo and a bunch of other roles. So let's talk about Almanac though. So starting Almanac a year before the onset of the pandemic could not have been more perfectly timed, as it probably allowed you to A/B test a lot of the features before you need to scale, which I'm sure was, something you were really happy you had. So what were some of those early predictions that you and your team made when building Almanac that helped you prepare for the rise of remote work later in 2020?
Looking at things now, it probably seems like we're geniuses and could predict the future. And to be honest, we weren't that smart when we started Almanac. As I mentioned, we knew that there was something in GitHub that was helping people work at a level of not just productivity, but satisfaction and focus and sustainability that the rest of us didn't have. And so we initially called ourselves GitHub for Docs, and it still is GitHub for Docs. Truly, that's what we built. And what has become clear ex post facto, now that everybody is working remotely, is that there are three aspects of GitHub that are relevant for distributed collaboration. And what GitHub, beyond just being a productivity tool, what it really enabled was distributed collaboration for engineers writing code. GitHub was Git is the language and GitHub is the platform, and both of them were built 15 to 20 years ago. And just to take you back in time, before Git and GitHub, in order for engineers to collaborate and write code together, they would have to be physically present. And so imagine, this is before even laptops, an engineer would have to take their desktop, like this big, 30-pound thing, like put it in their car, drive to some other engineer's house, like hook everything up, and then sit there and put the code on screens next to each other and like look line by line through to figure out what was changed from one piece of code to another. And of course, with code, unless it works perfectly together, it breaks and you can't have a functional application. And so this is mission critical processes for developing code, which is to compare them, check for conflicts, make sure it all works together, and merge it. And so Git is a language, and it basically allowed for engineers this idea of comparing code for it to happen automatically. And so it's like a total game changer for software development, because now any two people could compare their code next to each other. What GitHub did on top of that was actually bring all of this together into the browser. And so it used the web to allow for engineers to compare code anywhere around the world at any time, asynchronously. And on top of that code comparison, GitHub has this feature called pull requests, which are essentially workflows where an engineer can ask another engineer to review or approve their code. And the great thing about pull requests is that they don't require a meeting. An engineer gives all of the context with transparency upfront, attaches the code, all of the comments and tasks sent back and forth are logged, and so everyone understands how something came to be, where a request is in progress, and so you don't need to meet because you have all of that connectedness and organization and transparency. Again, we didn't know all of this would be so useful for the the future of work, which is obviously remote now. But if you want to work in a distributed fashion, which is to say remotely across time and space, number one, you need to write everything down. And so just like you write down code, at the core of Almanac is a real-time document editor, because if you have people all across the world, you can't possibly meet when somebody's sleeping and someone else is during their workday. So you have to write everything down. Number two, you have to have a way for people to compare closely related drafts and revisions and suggestions. I'm sure you've experienced the pain of having like thousands of Word files or Google Docs files that are totally disconnected, just like floating around. No one knows which is the final version. It's impossible to compare them. There's comments everywhere. And so, similar to GitHub and Git, Almanac has version control software that allows every any document to be connected to another document and to, in one click, be able to compare and then merge those documents. And so, because it's all connected in your browser in the cloud, it allows for that seamless collaboration on revisions and suggestions. And the third thing, just like GitHub, is that you need to be able to work asynchronously through common collaborative processes. So GitHub has pull requests, Almanac has workflows for reviews, feedback, approvals, read receipts. So basic types of collaboration, like, hey, did my boss read this? Hey, has Matt given me feedback on this? Hey, has the CEO signed off? Can be done asynchronously without a meeting, without Slack messages, without emails. Everything is organized in one place right next to the work. And so by copying GitHub, we essentially built a tool that allows regular business professionals who spend their days in docs to work in a distributed world.
Now, it's interesting. Like everyone obviously thinks GitHub and asynchronous, workflows make sense for technology companies because that's the way they're always thinking, right? Improving processes, try to bring more efficiency into their workflow. However, most traditional businesses are not always thinking that way. But when the pandemic hit, they had to be forced to think that way due to remote work. So, what were some of the biggest issues companies were seeing with Microsoft Word and Google Docs that may not have been realized beforehand that Almanac is trying to solve?
We think about the before way, we call it office culture. And if you think about our thesis at Almanac is that when you change the when and the where of work, the how also has to change. And as I mentioned, the biggest evidence we have for that is that as companies have just tried to like take the office and put it in a Zoom browser, people are exhausted, they're burning out, they're quitting their jobs, they're writing public petitions to their CEOs to allow them to work permanently from home. You just one doesn't fit on top of the other. And in office culture, the primary way things got done, decisions got made, collaboration happened was the meeting. Like the meeting was the technology for collaboration. And the meeting is really inefficient as a collaborative technology because number one, not everyone can be in the room. The rooms are often like they're obviously physically small, but you can't have your entire company in there. If you're not in the room, you have no idea what happened because there's no like transaction or record of exactly how a decision was made in a meeting. Often the loudest person wins. Stuff happens outside of the meeting. Like it's all very informal. There's no transparency, and that makes it really inefficient. You're not necessarily getting the best ideas from all of the people in the company with clear transparency that people can access to their jobs. And so the way that we were all working before in office culture was very inefficient, was very inequitable, was ineffective, but none of us really knew it because it was the water we were all swimming in, except for, of course, engineers and a couple of pioneering companies who figured this out before the rest of us. What has been clear since then is that, Microsoft Word and Google Docs are great document editors. I mean, they work pretty well for writing stuff down, but they weren't because they were designed for office culture. I mean, Microsoft Office is literally named after the place where collaboration and management happens. Microsoft Word is terrible at document management. It's terrible at document collaboration because it outsourced all those things to a meeting. And so, what we think we built, and what I think the future work portends, is a much more productive way of doing that basic collaboration, that management of work, so that people can actually spend the majority of their time not pushing paper around and working on all this overhead stuff, but actually focusing on the work that matters. And by that I mean the type of work that only human creativity can solve. It doesn't figuring out whether somebody read a document or whether your boss signed off, or like what changed from one version to another. That shouldn't be what a human spends their hours a day doing. We should be spending our time doing the type of creative, collaborative work that only people as intelligent as us can do. And instead, if you look at most office work and in office culture, and of course, there's lots of TVs and movies and pop culture references to this, it's inane. It does not use human capabilities at all. It's just like performative theater of like made up work. And I think that's what Almanac and I think every company that adopts distributed work and collaboration can ditch in favor of something much better.
That's interesting. It's like meetings about meetings about meetings, or like getting rid of the water cooler conversations that don't really have any ROI or productivity to them, is what you're basically calling out is the problems with office culture that we just were not willing to say before the pandemic. But, I also heard that your document editor found its way into some pretty interesting company use cases outside of the tech world, like companies like Domino's and veterinary offices. So how did that happen? And what insights did you derive from those unique customers that you probably never would have thought of if you just sold to tech companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the great thing about building a technology product is lots of people find it beyond the people who you built it for, and for something that's as widely used as a document editor or basic we call core productivity software. Microsoft Office has 300 million paid users. It's used by literally billions of people around the world every day. It's used, by soccer organizations, and it's used by community groups. It's used by political offices. It's used to make marketing flyers. There's innumerable use cases for it, and so I think we had hypothesized, but didn't expect it to happen so fast that Almanac would be adopted by a wide range of organizations outside of tech, and that's great because most of the economy are not tech companies and startups. They're regular businesses that are trying to make a profit and regular people who are trying to build a life for themselves and their families. And so I think we were really heartened by the quick adoption. I think one thing it made us realize, which we felt stupid about afterwards, is that there were a lot of organizations that were doing distributed work, remote work, before there was such a term. As you mentioned, any franchise, any political entity, any community association, any global corporation was already working across time and space. They were just doing so really inefficiently, and wasting a ton of time trying to manually coordinate collaboration versus using like newer modern tools built off of the powerful technology of the cloud. And so we realized, wow, this market's a lot bigger than we expected. One of my favorite customers is a helicopter rescue company in Alaska, who uses Almanac to run their standard operating procedures. That's probably as far from Silicon Valley as you can expect. But if you think about what they do, they need mission critical software they can rely on to communicate information and policies and procedures. And Almanac works just as well for them as it does for a YC backed startup in San Francisco.
Any idea how they found you? Like some of these like kind of weird use case, like how did the veterinary offices find you? I only asked because my sister-in-law is a vet and they still like use pen and paper. They're like some of the oldest tech stacks I've ever seen in vet offices. So just that one threw me for a curveball.
Yeah, I mean, we have universities using Almanac, sports teams, nonprofit organizations, as you mentioned, like the Red Cross, mayors, governors, congressional offices. We don't market to any of those people specifically if you look at our website, but I think a lot of them experience the pain points that we solve. And so, for example, the most wiki there's lots of wiki products out there, but the information you can't trust. And so with Almanac, we have a workflow where anybody can suggest changes to a document while keeping the final approval with the owner of that document. And so it just solves that problem. Our async workflows around giving feedback. If you have an organization that can't give feedback all at the same time, having a way to see people's feedback next to a document, link all the comments and tasks into that request, have total transparency about how the document came to be, how the conversation is going, that solves problems for really anyone who's trying to collaborate in a distributed way. And so my guess is that a lot of people just typed a problem into Google and found us as a result. And then from there, it's been word of mouth. We spend basically nothing on paid ads, and so it's I'd say 99% of our customers have come through organic channels, and so a lot of that I think is word of mouth and Twitter and people sharing us around.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, like your open source library named Core, which you mentioned before, is described as a hub for user submitted guides on everything from how to run a one on one meeting to how to structure salaries for your customer service team. And I've heard there's over 5,000 templates in the Core library now, which is incredible. What was the thinking behind Core and how has it helped you scale quicker?
Yeah, and back to the software metaphor. A key tenet of software development is open source code, and so for problems that have already been solved, like how to do a drop down menu or how to think about email and password verification, engineers don't have to reinvent the wheel or start from scratch. They can use someone else's code that has been open sourced, so that instead the code development and time you spend on it is really focused on new problems, the hardest problems. And yet, if you think about how business professionals work, especially in communities of practitioners, so much time is spent solving problems that have already been solved. Like how many times have interviewers for a specific position created the same questions, company over company over company, and so the core is basically we call it open source docs because it helps to provide proven templates from validated experts in different fields that people can use. So unlike the kind of generic template galleries in most productivity software, our idea is to use our community, use the brilliance of experts out there to, as they're willing, open source their knowledge and get recognition for it. but allow people to find very specific answers to questions they have so that they can spend time not reinventing the wheel, but doing the work that really matters. I think where you will see us take the core is similar to software development, allowing communities of practitioners, like people working on hard problems, whether it's like climate change or saving democracy or fighting COVID, to share knowledge, not just the final work product, but actually how it got there across organizations. So imagine like Reddit for documents, and deep knowledge, where people can use the same workflows that they have in Almanac around giving revisions, suggestions, feedback, approvals, not just on work within their organization, but across organizations. And we think, if we can use the collaborative infrastructure of Almanac to connect whole communities of people, perhaps we can solve problems better than we did before.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, just to see like that is similar to what we see in Notion as well, with some of the templates you can copy and use for yourself as well. But one other feature that I really love is your snippets feature, which allows you to save oft used blocks of text so that they can quickly be added to new documents, which sounds super helpful for things like lawyers and consultants and freelancers. What kind of use cases are you seeing from that feature, and how did you beta test that originally?
Often when you do software development, there's a master branch, which is basically like the thing that everything else merges into eventually. In code, there can only be one final version that is deployed that people can use. And one of the ideas in code is that as the master branch changes, if you're working on your own piece over here, you can actually pull changes from the master into your piece of work so that you're working off of the latest copy. On the business professional side of things, when it comes to documents, there's so many, whether it's like boilerplate copy, piece of paragraph that you put at the end of every press release, to interview templates, to sales contracts. There's so much work that is just kind of copy and pasted from document to document. And so we thought, how do we automate a lot of that out, especially the part around updating? And so step one for us was allowing people to save, as you mentioned, snippets of text, which can be single lines, paragraphs, whole documents, and then basically paste them in using our command line into any document. And in the future, we'll allow people to actually pull updates to their snippets so that you can kind of go to the original snippet, and if you change something there, it can automatically update in all the documents that use it. And so it's almost like, if you think about software, turning pieces of text into things that you don't have to spend time updating version over version, doc over doc, but instead just happen automatically. And it's just one of those ways that we can see we try and automate out basic forms of collaboration and management so that people can spend time on what matters. And as you mentioned, super useful for lots of power users for documents: lawyers, researchers, writers, journalists, salespeople, people who are spending a lot of time kind of copy pasting, managing work, and spend more time than anyone doing a lot of what often feels like overhead work.
Yeah, I mean, wow, I got to get my lawyers using this so that they can cut my legal bills in half, because it does feel like they're just taking from one template to another sometimes and still charging me a full fare, right?
They probably are.
All right, I'll be following up with you to get my lawyers on Almanac after this. Now, one thing you've stated personally is that you don't believe in hybrid work models, but say that companies have to pick a side of either being an in office culture or a cloud culture. You said it's a one-way door. So, can you elaborate on what you mean by that and explain why you don't believe a hybrid model can work?
Hybrid to me feels like a reaction of people who really like office culture to try and save it. And so it's like a negotiation tactic of, there's this disruptive wave coming of remote work. And like, oh, maybe we'll split the difference, and we'll write a policy where people can spend 2 days at home and 3 days in the office. But as I mentioned, distributed work is not just about the when and the where, it's about the how. When it comes to the how, and by this I mean I'm talking about, who are you designing the work environment, work processes, collaboration for. It's really hard to split the difference for the how. It's if you think about, let's take a meeting. You either design a remote meeting for the people who are in the office, which is probably not changing anything at all from how it was before, how it has always been with office culture, or you design for people who are not in the office, and that means likely having everybody on their own screens, having everybody have their own AirPods, making sure that the meeting is fully documented so everybody can see the same information. Having collaborate if you're having a meeting around brainstorming, making sure everyone can participate. If you have a hybrid work policy, but you don't actually change the way you work, essentially anyone who's not in the office is incapacitated. Imagine if, like, in some ways, you're physically disabled with like your hands tied behind your back, or your voice muted or your inability to hear. That's what it can be like for companies that are hybrid in name or hybrid in policy, but haven't actually changed how they work, because the people who are not in the office can't fully participate, they can't fully hear, they can't fully see, and so you're basically creating a second class tier of employees if you don't change how you work. And so we think that you have to pick a side. You either default to office culture or you default to cloud culture. People can be in an office in a culture that defaults to distributed and cloud work. The way work is done is designed so that regardless of where you are, regardless of when you're working, you're able to contribute equally to anybody else. I think it's honestly we've been saying this for months now, and it's becoming super clear to companies I think that have been on this hybrid journey that in fact it's about more than just a policy. If you really want to be successful and win in this new era that we now live in, you have to change how you work. It's not just about like having HR write a policy and then calling it a day. You have to pick a side, and there is a winning side, and that's companies that embrace distributed remote work and distributed collaboration and design everything around it.
Yeah. So just to clarify, what you're saying is that if you're going to choose to have remote work, you need to have a cloud first culture so that everyone can have an equal opportunity to work remotely. You can still have an office, but that office cannot be reliant on certain how to workflows. Meaning, like, you can't have like 90% of your tools allow people to work remotely, but there's still 10% of it that can only be done in an office culture, is what you're saying.
Yeah, we call Almanac a cultural choice, not a productivity tool, because what we're really selling is a different way of working. We're not selling a document editor or even version control. We're selling an entirely different way of doing things, a way that's about ditching meetings in order to focus. And so it's a big transition for many companies that fully embrace Almanac, because it's very different than the way most people have worked for most of their lives. But what we hear from most of our customers is like, wow, we didn't know that being this productive was this possible. And it's not just about a different way of working, it's about a different way of living. Like if you can work largely asynchronously and collaborate asynchronously, that means you don't have to work on 9 to 5. You can live wherever. Like if you want to go surfing in the morning, you can do that. If you want to spend time with your kids in the afternoon, you can do that and still be as productive, as effective as anybody else. And it reduces, as we talked about before, the need for all of this like productivity theater where people are constantly sending updates and pretending like sitting in meetings all day is getting anything done for the organization. We think cloud culture, distributed culture are about, yeah, a lot more than the tool you use. It's about the way that you're working, how you hire, how you manage, how you collaborate. One thing you see in often a lot of distributed companies, is a ton more diversity, because when you can hire people wherever, that means you can hire the best person for the job versus just the person that's available in your local area. You can hire people that don't just like look like everyone on your team, but are actually the best person for that role. You can hire people. You can like depend on people statements of how people work versus just what's on their resume. And so you end up seeing teams that are not just geographically diverse, but racially diverse, much more gender balanced. Have veterans and working parents and people of different ages and people of different neurodiversity settings, all being able to work just as effectively as people in an office. And so, there's way more benefits to distributed culture than just productivity. We think it's a more equitable environment, and so yeah, it's a totally different way of working and managing. And we see, that we think that's the big challenge for companies that want to win, is this, that they will all have to transition from the way it was to the way it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the diversity angle is a huge benefit that we don't really talk about much, but it definitely expands the labor force and the labor pool that you can pull from if you take a cloud first or remote first approach. I got to ask, are you remote first? I assume. Like, it looks like you're in an office, but
Oh, really? This is my apartment. So yeah, we will
oh,
never. No, no, no.
you never have an office.
We
Yeah,
will
you
never
got to
have
eat
it.
your own dog food.
That's exactly right.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a super extroverted person, to be honest. I used to really enjoy hanging out with people in the office, but what I've discovered for myself is that while I'm just as extroverted, I now spend a lot more time with my family, with my friends. I spend time in my local community. I'm able to, get a coffee in the morning from the shop down the street and try different places for lunch. And I feel my life outside of work is so much fuller and richer because of the way that our culture is set up. And so it's not that, well, I think sometimes people think, oh, asynchronous work, like, are you alone all day? I'm actually around way more people than I ever used to be before. And unlike people who I didn't get a chance to, I don't get to decide to be with, in this case, my life is much more in my control.
I absolutely love that. And I mean, obviously, people are always talking about their 9 to 5 life, but you've got like your 5 to 9 and your 9 to 5 combined, and you can do everything in between, which is great. Now, I'd love to talk about your company's fundraising journey. As you originally announced a 9 million seed round in May of 2020, led by Floodgate, and then a $34 million Series A led by the lightning fast guys at Tiger Global in September. So, can you share more about your experience working with the team at Floodgate and now John Curtis and his team at Tiger, and how that Series A round came together?
Well, we didn't actually go out to raise a Series A, which is always the best way to raise money. Tiger came to us, and yeah, we're super fortunate to have them as partners on this journey. I think what interested Tiger about us is obviously the size of the market that we are competing in and disrupting. Core productivity, which is a market that has been long dominated by Microsoft, is the largest enterprise market of all. As I mentioned before, Microsoft has 300 million paid users. Microsoft Office is still growing at 25% quarter over quarter, and it's not just an old piece of software; it's totally outmoded for the way that we work and live now. And so they're really hard to compete against because the foundations of what it takes to allow someone to write documents and collaborate in them is it takes a long time to build the type of software we're building. And because it's infrastructure, it has to work, it has to be fast, it has to be reliable, it has to be ideally even beautiful, such that you actually like spending time in it. And so it's a really hard market to compete in. But once you have that technology and you have people using it and showing that they love it, you're in a really great position because those benefits compound over and over and over again. I mentioned GitHub and Figma as kind of parallels for us, but I think Stripe is another technology company that sees itself as building financial infrastructure, and they're obviously 15 years ahead of us. But you can see the power of infrastructure in terms of business size and growth. I think that's what Floodgate and what Tiger saw in us and saw in the feedback and engagement and love that we get from our customers. And our product is still in closed beta. It'll be open to everybody in a couple months in January. And so we're just getting started. It's still like day one for us. And so it's really exciting to think about all of our potential ahead. And I think that's what gets our investors excited as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, we love the productivity space as well. We've got investments like VoiceFlow and ZenHub and Buildable that are all working in the same areas as well. So we're obviously bullish as well as Tiger and Floodgate is on the productivity space. Now, before we wrap things up, we always like to ask our guests for their fast favorites. I list off six topics. You name your favorite of each. So first one, your favorite podcast.
I list Smartless with Jason Bateman.
Nice. So funny. Those guys are great together. Favorite newsletter or blog?
Wait, But Why by Tim Urban.
Nice. Favorite tech gadget?
It's hard because I'm an Apple fanboy these days, but I'd say my AirPods. I wear them all the time for everything.
Absolutely. Favorite new trend?
I don't think this is new, but artisanal coffee. I've gotten really into grinding my own beans and making my own coffee every morning, and it's one of the best parts of my day.
And are you like a pour over kind of guy, or what do you do?
Always. Only pour over.
Always pour over. Okay. Just making sure. Favorite book?
Deep Work by Cal Newport.
Nice. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson?
Do your homework.
Sweet and simple. Thanks so much for joining us in the tank today with Adam Nathan, co-founder and CEO of Almanac.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Tank Talks. To learn more about this episode, be sure to go to Apple Podcast or Spotify to find more detailed notes on this episode or to check out previous episodes. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and a rating as it helps us out a lot. And hit that subscribe button so you can get notified when new episodes come out. Finally, make sure to give me a follow on Twitter @MattyBCohen or @Tank Talk Podcast to stay up to date on new episodes or to be a guest on our show. Till next time,